Today's subject is buttonholes and lots of ways to make them. They can be extremely simple, a little bit more involved, possibly reinforced. They can be knitted horizontally or vertically. And the main use for them is going to be on cardigans, also frequently baby clothes and sometimes pillows. With that in mind, these techniques will help you if you have my books on standard gauge or bulky cardi-kets. They are so named because they include both cardigan and jacket looks. Of course, you may use these techniques on anything else you happen to be knitting. This is the simplest of all buttonholes, and here is how we make it. Take one stitch, transfer it to the next needle, leave the empty needle and work as though you were knitting lace. And you have a tidy buttonhole. Of course, the exact size of it will vary with the gauge of the fabric. I am working on a bulky machine only to show you the easiest thing to see. These techniques work exactly the same for all machines. There is a possible refinement of this basic buttonhole. Starts out just like the first. If we wanted it a little bit tighter and tidier, we could lift this first loop, twist it, and rehang it on the same needle. And you can see the difference in the two. Should that not be quite big enough, but you still want a super simple buttonhole, you can transfer one left and one right. Of course, both cannot begin to knit immediately. So let's only put one backing work. Let's twist it. Now put the other back in work, but lift and hold part of the loop. Since this is twisted, it will behave like a stitch and allow this next one that we didn't twist to knit off. Whoops, this needle misbehaved. I'll just manually knit that. This is what should have happened. If this doesn't seem neat enough to you, and many times it won't because this is kind of crude, we'll twist it. And that's not bad at all if you need a bigger button opening. The next option doesn't have such size limitations. It can be made quite big. We're going to actually bind off the number of stitches that we want to use in the buttonhole. This would allow for an 1.5 inch button, so this one's big. I'm binding off in chain stitch. And now I'm going to cast on the same exact needles. Now you do not have to do 5 needles. That's just an example of how to make a big buttonhole. And this last loop from my chain stitch where I cast on, it's going on the needle next to the buttonhole. So later we'll be able to tie these two tails together and weave them in, and that will prevent the buttonhole from growing where there's slack in the yarn. We do not have to knit back from hold for the next row, but it often makes it easier. You can see that with this many stitches bound off, and the size it is, 1.25 inches wide, and it'll stretch, the edges may begin to roll. And later we can come and chain stitch or back stitch around them if that's undesirable. But for comparison, let's also do a 3-stitch buttonhole of the same size. That'll be more like 3/4 of an inch wide. In bulky yarn, that is. The gauge on this fabric is about 4 stitches per inch. That is why 3 stitches will be a 3/4 inch wide buttonhole. Bind off the 3 in chain stitch. I didn't talk you through this part, though I showed you. Lift off the gate pegs. Bring the same needles back for casting on. 1, 2, oops, I split the yarn. And hang. Now I'm using a separate piece of yarn. My main yarn is still threaded. I'm using the same kind of yarn, but this takes a separate piece. And we'll continue knitting. Now here's the smaller opening, too small to allow for rolling. And here's where we would tie the yarn tails together and weave them in. And there will be our buttonhole. Now every method that I've showed you so far produces either a round buttonhole or a sideways, horizontally positioned buttonhole. But what if you need a vertical buttonhole? Let's set the machine so that it will not knit back from hold, because we need to use the hold feature. And on the side away from the carriage, I'm going to put all those needles in hold. Here's the buttonhole position between these 2 needles. And let's say knit 4 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I have to break the yarn so as to knit on the other batch of needles. Knit all the way across, put everything in hold, put the previously unused needles back to work. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I am just going to return all the needles to work and continue knitting. If there was a need to keep track of your left and right, what you would do is break this yarn. You'll have a second yarn tail because of it, but then do a free pass across with all the needles in hold, and then you'd end up on the right hand side again. And for some designs, that the shaping would require that. Just to demonstrate a buttonhole, it does not. I'm going to set the carriage to knit these back from hold just for simplicity. Our slit is now the same length on both sides, so we can just keep knitting. If you are adding this buttonhole to a design that didn't have buttonholes in it, suppose you're making a cardigan out of a pullover design and you realize that simply cutting the front stitches in half and then adding a few for the band will work. You're right, but the row counts haven't included this. So it's very simple. Let's do it one more time and I'll show you what will happen. Let's say we're up to row 40. So we're going to knit 1, 42, 43, 44, turn, reach over, the row counter's over there, turn it back to 40, put these in hold, break the yarn, move across with everything still in hold. At this point, our row counter reads the 40 that it still read at the bottom of the slit, or that it read previously when we began the slit. So when we go 41, 2, 3, 4, it will now read 44, and that will be accurate, because we did 4 here and 4 here, but we didn't add 8 on the row counter, because after these 4, we turn the row counter back. So now we can continue knitting. I'll just set the carriage to knit back from hole and off we go. If you need reinforcement on a buttonhole like this, it can be done with an extra piece of yarn. I'm going to knot a loop into the yarn. We're going to do the same thing with one little addition. I'm setting the carriage to hold. Hanging the loop on the first held needle. Then I'm going to E-wrap the first needle next to the slit that's going to knit. I'm going to do it very clumsily. Upper working position is easier to knit back from here. 1. E-wrap again. 2. And we're going to E-wrap every row. You're probably catching on to this now. 3. 4. So I'm just going to leave my spare reinforcement yarn hanging. Break the main yarn as we did before. These go into hold. We knit across just to get to the other side. Put the other batch in hold. There's already a loop on here, anchored, but we're going to also E-wrap with, let's see, I E-wrapped with the wrong thing, with the other piece. Let me describe that better. The strand of yarn that falls to the left of the loop is what I'm E-wrapping with. Previously on the other stitches, I was using the strand that fell to the right of the loop. And just as before, we will E-wrap this end needle, the one that'll be right by the buttonhole, prior to knitting every row. We'll always have to double check that it did knit off because we're challenging the needle a little bit. Upper working position, knit. Had to help that one. Wrap, upper working position. A way to assist the knitting is to keep your thumb pinching the fabric and pulling down just a hair where I am. Now we're all done. These two ends can be tied together so that the reinforcement won't grow and later woven in. And now I'm going to knit everybody back from hole and get us back to normal knitting. So what we've achieved is a firmer edge because there's extra yarn around the buttonhole area. And here's a method where we can do something now and finish the buttonhole later. I'm going to hand knit in a contrasting piece of yarn into the area that I want the buttonhole to be. And then we'll just keep knitting. There's no problem with that at all. Later, we will either backstitch or chain stitch through this loop, all the pinks that you see, and finish the buttonhole and then remove the contrasting yarn. Now suppose this is a cardigan, but what we're looking at is the area that the band is, and it's a knitted on band, and I'm going to fold it, double it, and finish the front edge like that. If you didn't quite follow what I said, it will become clearer in a minute. Usually we would have allowed, let's say 2, 4, 6 stitches for the width of the band in this. Now this would be a stitch that I'm going to drop and latch up as a rib stitch, well, a purl stitch, to form the edge of the band. And then the next 6 will be the other half of the cardigan band. So it'll fold like this, and where my thumbs are is the purl stitch. So let's do a little bit to define the band edge. This would have been happening all the way down the front. And you can use any of these styles of buttonhole in this way. The easiest is the single transfer. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate with. Now you can see this is part of the band, this is part of the band, and the remainder of the knitting is a cardigan. 1, 2, counting 3 over will make an eyelet. But when we fold the band, we don't want this eyelet to be backed by fabric, otherwise the button can't get through. So 1, 2, 3 over, symmetrically on the other side, we transfer the other stitch and then knit several rows. At this point, I'm ready for another buttonhole. You can do all of the relatching later if you want to, but generally I do it a little bit along. So I'll make my edge purl stitch and do the same thing that I did last time. Count over to the 3rd stitch from the purl in each direction. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Make sure these are still in work. Remember, you could do the twist, you could do a doubled transfer, any one of these that there is room for. Now it's time to drop and relatch this for the edge. Now here is how that band works. Either side can be the right side, but if you do it this way, the purl side is the right side of the sweater. Held this way, the knit side is the right side of the sweater, and the band is purl. You can see our 2 sets of buttonholes lining up. You can stitch them together if you feel they need it. Often they don't, but that's your call. And you may choose to use sewing thread that matches rather than the knitting yarn, just because that adds quite a bit of bulk in a place that already has 2 layers, especially using worsted yarn as I am. This area along the edge can be stitched down using any method you like. I just used my yarn tail here to chain stitch it down. It's actually, I usually prefer to hand stitch it down because chain stitch makes 2 strands of yarn, and again it's a little bit bulky, but it was a quick way to show you what's going on. One way or another, whether you like the chain stitch and you want to use it for decorative purposes or you'd rather have it smoother, you join these 2 layers, and then the cardigan front comes off the machine basically complete. Well, let's go back and finish this. You can work from either side of the fabric that you want, the knit side or the purl side. Let's start with showing you the purl side. Here I'm going to back stitch around, skipping all the contrasting colors. So up, down into the previous pink loop, up into the one ahead. Control your tension so it doesn't get too tight, but you also don't want loops. Down, moving back, up, moving forward, down, moving back, up, moving forward, down, moving back. I like to go ahead to this loop Now note we did not knit into that loop, but it makes the buttonhole sturdier and it doesn't tend to pull out of shape as easily. So we've gone down to the next row of knitting, the previously knitted one actually, back and across. Okay, now we cross the other horizontal sweep of the buttonhole. Up, down and back, forward and up, down and back, forward and up, down and back. Now here we are at the other end, and again I'm going to stitch into a pink loop that was actually not part of the buttonhole, so as to anchor the corner and make it sturdier. And I'm going back through the beginning loop, and later we can tie these two ends together and weave them in. Now we want to complete the buttonhole by releasing these stitches. We could simply go where my tool is with yarn snips, and we'd have a lot of little yarn pieces to pull out, and that works fine. Or it's just a few stitches, we can release them like that. These did not have to be back stitches. They could be chain stitches. Here's another one of the buttonholes done with a contrasting yarn. Let's work from the front and chain stitch finish it. Pushing the tool through from the front and through a corner that was not actually stitched into with the alternate yarn to anchor it, just as described below. Now from the front things look a little different. See that U? That's our stitch. So I want to work into it and pull up my chain stitch. Let me do that again. I believe I split the yarn somehow. Into the U, grab the working yarn, pull it up. Here's the next U. Into that, pull up. I will tell you that I prefer the chain stitch look almost all the time to the back stitched look. But they're both respected ways of doing this, and in some circumstances you may prefer one over the other. Working from the front also permits you to see how it's going to look better. Now I'm going to go over to the corner, into a stitch that's not actually part of the opening to anchor for the turn. Then this U. Try not to work through your contrasting yarn. It's not the end of the world if you do, but it's going to make it harder to release it and finish your buttonhole. Try not to get tangled with it. This U's been worked into. Here's my next one. One more right there. And to finish it up, I'll go over here to the corner again. Again, working into a stitch that was not actually included in the green yarn. Now pull this to the wrong side, and I can anchor it later. And release the contrasting stitches, and we'll soon be done. Because of how we've worked, our chain stitches won't immediately fall right on the edge of the fabric because I had working room. All you have to do is push them down with your thumb or finger. And that's a nice, sturdy, well-reinforced buttonhole. There's one more stitch to be moved into position, let's see. Both cardi-kit collections are available at theanswerlady.com.